Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time it is, wherever you happen to be logging into this presentation from. It's early evening here in Chicago for whatever it's worth, and I'm Nick Epley. I'm professor of behavioral science and the faculty director of the Center for Decision Research at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. I'm delighted to welcome you to our second pandemic-inspired or maybe pandemic-required virtual Think Better presentation. This talk series presents our efforts through the Center for Decision Research to try to bring basic behavioral science research to your attention in a way that's relevant and actionable in your daily life. Although many aspects of your daily life have likely shut down or changed quite dramatically in recent months, I'm delighted to report that the research that we've been doing in the PIMCO Decision Research Labs is still going as strong as it possibly can be because we moved all of our operations online since the pandemic started in early March and into April. This has proven to be a huge success for us. In just 3 months, we've managed to enroll a little over 2,200 people as potential research participants in our experiments who are helping us do the best behavioral science work that we can. And we've conducted more than 11,000 experimental sessions. The quality of the work that we do in the Center for Decision Research depends critically on people's willingness to help us do that work, including you. One of the benefits of going online is that anyone can now quite easily participate in our research, and we would love to have you participate if you are interested. You saw a link on the welcome page before this talk started, and you will get a note afterwards over email telling you more about how you might be able to participate and get involved in our research, so please keep an eye out for that. One of the more basic and fundamental findings in all of behavioral science is a result suggesting that people can at times be somewhat maddening. They'll report believing one thing and then go off and do something else. They'll report having a strong intention to do something good and then we'll run off and do something bad. Our minds seem to be something of a mystery to us. We don't seem to know ourselves that well. We want to treat men and women equally and fairly, and yet the Me Too movement highlights just how rampant sexism still is in modern life. We want to respect people regardless of the color of their skin, and yet the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement in recent months have highlighted how rampant systemic racism still is in modern life. Most of us sincerely want to be good people, and yet even we sometimes act in ways that are inconsistent with our ideals, often without us being aware. Psychologists like me and many others have spent a lot of time documenting these sorts of effects, but very few of us have really identified what we can do about it in our own lives, with one very clear exception, and that is tonight's speaker, Dolly Chugh. I'm so delighted, grateful to have her here with us tonight. She's just the best speaker for this time right now that we could possibly think to have with us. Dolly's an award-winning professor of management and organizations at the NYU Stern School of Business. She's done more thinking than any psychologist I know about how to help us put our good intentions and plans into practice, focused especially in recent years on issues related to diversity and inclusion. She is the speaker for our times that we're in right now. Dolly has just written a terrific book, came out a couple of years ago, 2018, titled The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias, which has been covered by every major news outlet you likely have ever read. Her related TED Talk was named one of the 25 most popular TED Talks in 2018 and currently has more than 4 million views. And Dolly has recently launched a free monthly newsletter called Dear Good People, offering people actionable advice for how to put behavioral science research into practice in their daily lives. I highly recommend you sign up for it if you are interested. You've seen the invitation for this, for Dolly's newsletter in the invitation for tonight's event. Nicely, Dolly didn't just want to talk to us, but she wanted to hear from us. And in particular, what she wanted to do was to solicit questions from our community and then take tonight to answer some of those questions. And much to my deep gratitude, Jane Risen, a professor of behavioral science here at Booth, has agreed to serve as the moderator for this conversation tonight. Jane teaches a wildly popular and really important class called Diversity in Organizations, which uses Dolly's book, so she's the perfect person in our community to guide this conversation tonight. Dolly, thank you so much for being part of this tonight. We are really grateful. And Jane, thank you so much too. Jane, take it away.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you so much for being here, Dolly.
Oh, thank you.
I know that you aren't accepting many invitations of this sort, so we feel very honored that you made an exception for us.
Well, I love you and I love Jane. I love you and I love Nick. So I'm thrilled to be here with you.
We have so much enthusiasm. Nick mentioned all of the registrations. We got a ton of questions. I want to note to everybody out there listening how gratifying that is for me personally. It feels amazing to be part of a community where there's such eagerness to learn more about this topic. Of course, there were more questions than we're going to get to tonight, so we're going to just do the best we can and cover as much as we can. What I'm going to try to do is when I ask questions, people may not hear it in the words that they used, of course, because there were a lot of questions that were similar. I tried to pull the questions that there was a lot of interest in, and also I tried to pull questions where I thought your voice, Dolly, would be particularly relevant and your research would be particularly relevant. So we've known each other a long time. And as Nick just mentioned, I use your book in class, and so it has made my life tremendously easy compared to if that book didn't exist. But of course, this is not always the common thing to do as an academic. Writing journal articles is more common. And so maybe just to kick things off, I'm curious to hear a little bit about what inspired you to write this book.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, Jane, it's there's this cliche that research is me search. And I think, I don't know if that applies to everybody, but I feel that one. I look at the research I do and the research you do and the research so many of our colleagues do, and there's tools, there's strategy, there's, to what Nick was saying earlier, there's things we can use and do and put to work. And I feel the need for that. Like, I'm constantly struggling with my own mishaps and missteps and mistakes. Like, the world is complicated and confusing, and I feel like I need tools and strategies to sort of close that gap between the person I mean to be and how I show up a lot of the time. And so I think there were a couple of key moments, one of which was when I was attending my first ever protest. I don't really consider myself a protester, but I, at that moment, felt I needed to be at a Black Lives Matter protest a few years ago, and was really impressed by what I was seeing on the ground, the peaceful, well-organized, very strategic work going on. And at the same time, I couldn't see a place in that work for me. Like, I felt really old, frankly, and really like just very not useful. And in that moment, I thought all those tools and strategies that I have access to because I am a scholar in this field that I find useful, it would be useful for everybody. We should all have access to that. And maybe I could play a role in translation and curation in bringing the research of so many great scholars together and weave it together with stories. So stories and science together. And truthfully, I did it. I wrote the book that I felt I needed to read.
Yeah. So let me tug on one of those, I think, important ideas, which is that you write about being a good-ish person. So not a good person, but a good-ish person. Yeah. Can you unpack that for everybody and say what it means to be a good-ish person and why that matters?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on a campaign to get us all to stop trying to be good people. Like, this is going to be my embarrassing legacy, as I was trying to convince everyone to stop trying to be good people. The reason, though, is that we know from social science that we have all these gaps that Nick outlined, in broad strokes, these big gaps between, we think, I'm going to use myself as an example. I think in class, I'm equitably calling on people with their hands up. But when I had a teaching assistant track, she said I was calling on men disproportionately over women, and I was interrupting women disproportionately sooner than I was interrupting men. I mean, that is not how I thought I was teaching at all. And yet it's emblematic of the kinds of blind spots we see in research. So this good person identity where we just are good people, it doesn't take practice, it doesn't take skill, it doesn't take mistakes and learning and coaching, is not held up by the research. So the reason I want us to let go of that really narrow binary and grow ourselves into a work in progress, which I'm calling a goodish person, is that matches the reality of what we know from the research. Some folks listening in might know the research of Carol Dweck and her team around growth mindset and fixed mindset. And if you know that research, what I'm describing should resonate there. That when we think of ourselves as a good person, it's I'm stuck in place. I'm a good person, and therefore I'm not going to need to pay attention to mistakes because I'm not going to make them. Versus I'm a goodish person, I'm always getting better every day. Mindset scholars have shown when they look at brain activity that when you're in a fixed mindset, you just view yourself as static, and a mistake is pointed out to you, your brain activity actually drops. Like you literally withdraw attention from the mistake, because why would you pay attention to a mistake? It's only going to make you feel bad, and there's nothing to learn from it, because remember, you're static, you're not a work in progress. Same scholars, when they put people in a growth mindset, meaning they just said, hey, think of yourself as a work in progress. This is something you can get better at. And then the person made a mistake, the mistake was pointed out, brain activity actually went up in those moments. Why? Because why not flood that mistake with attention? We may not like it, but there's some utility for us in it. So what I'm describing as a goodish person is that growth mindset. And to me, it's what cracks open all this work on diversity and inclusion. We're not going to make any progress if we approach this from a standpoint of, I should already know how to do this, or I do already know how to do this. If we can approach it from a standpoint of, I'm getting better, I'm learning, and there's more I'm going to learn tomorrow and the day after and next year, I think we're going to make a lot of progress that way.
So I think this next question is going to build on that, just as you were sort of saying, that this is a space that when you're talking to people who are different than you, when you're trying to engage with people who might just come at things from a different place, that's an opportunity for mistakes and an opportunity for misunderstanding. And so we're going to start with our incremental goodish mindset. And a lot of people wanted to know, then what do you do when you see something that's problematic? So a lot of the questions were focused on, how do I engage with someone who says something or posts something that is offensive? And I'll just highlight this, that there was a set of questions that were focused on people who don't realize that they're being offensive, that you're taking, that you feel offended, but you're not sure that they would have realized it or intended it. And then there's sort of a separate group of questions that were about, what do I do when I'm offended? And I think that they know they're being offensive. They're deliberately taking positions that I think of as clearly offensive.
Yeah.
And so with my goodish mindset, what do I do? How do I engage when I find occasions of this sort?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a great example of something I feel like I'm wrestling with every single day as well. So part of what we're wrestling with is what's inside us, and part of it is what we're wrestling with is what's outside us. And the goodish piece is here inside, and then what you're just describing is now the challenge outside. So the newsletter, the Dear Good People newsletter, I just released the most recent one on Sunday, and it's on my website if you want to see it. But I'm going to summarize it now. Talks about what I call UGH moments, UGH, which sounds a lot like my name, but it's not. I mean like UGH. And it stands for U, unintentional, G, galling, and H, hateful. That there's these posts, let's say on social media, which range from being kind of unintentionally, like kind of not getting it, to galling, like, to hateful, like there to harm. And the rule that I am suggesting we use, and actually as somebody closely associated with Booth has taught me this rule, Susan Lucia Annunzio, the 20-60-20 rule. The way the 20-60-20 rules works is that, and this is my adaptation, don't hold her responsible for the way I've sort of adapted it, is that think of when there's something kind of new to be considered, that 20% of us are kind of going to be on board. Like maybe we didn't get it, like this is the you, the unintentional, but like we're open to it once we see it. 20% of people are never, ever going to be open to it at all, like really closed off. And then there's this group in the middle, we're calling it 60%. I mean, these numbers are stylized, not precise, but some big group in the middle that just isn't engaging too much on whatever the particular issue is. They don't have a strong opinion on it. They're not deeply engaged. Now, what tends to happen in these moments is that stuck 20, which is very vocal, by the way. And this is with any change. It could be like the new accounting system at your company, but that stuck 20, for whatever reason, the mountain they're going to die on is they're never letting the new accounting system come through. Or in this particular social media moment, let's say, they're gonna fight you to the death on whatever they posted, whatever hateful thing they posted. And we get into a big back and forth, or we just completely disengage and walk away. And what I'm proposing is, in those moments, what we want to do is remember that middle 60. That middle 60, the one that isn't super engaged, they're going to go where the winds blow. And what I mean when I say where the winds blow is I mean to evoke the decades of incredible research we have on social norms and how social norms affect behavior. That we like to think our moral compass determines what we do, but what the research says is that more likely than not, we litter when other people litter. We're late when other people are late, and vice versa. And so what we want to do is engage that middle 60 more. So how do we engage? We first think about who we're engaging with. If it's that open 20, definitely engage. Just maybe find a private way to do it, have the conversation, know they're going to be receptive. If it's that closed 20, resist the urge to exhaust yourself in an endless loop. You know, this is your family member at the holiday meal, if we have those again, or the holiday Zoom meal, who just wears you out in the argument. And then you look over and you notice your cousin hasn't looked up from their soup, like your cousin's suddenly very, very interested in soup. Your cousin's that middle 60. They've like disengaged because they're not sure where they fall. What you want to do is catch your cousin in the kitchen, because instead of wasting your time with the close 20, you can actually influence the middle 60. So in summary, 20-60-20 allows us to deal with a lot of these UGG comments by directing our attention in a focused way to where we can have the most impact. And I think that's the open 20 and the middle 60. Last comment on that, researchers of influence tell us that when we're trying to influence someone who's not deeply invested on an issue, like the middle 60, we're going to be more effective if we humanize the issue with stories than with statistics and data and like big fact patterns. Even though we may have all that ready to go, with that middle 60 on that issue that they're not deeply invested in, what we want to do is make the issue come alive to invest them in it. So that's what I've been trying, and I actually find it really effective that to not get caught up in the futile back and forths, but still engage, don't walk away, but write comments or open up conversations where I'm thinking of what would help the middle 60 engage on this issue, as opposed to what would prove that closed 20, show how wrong they are.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the idea of thinking about who is your audience and what is my goal in engagement.
Exactly.
Right? And if I have those two questions lined up, then it's going to dramatically change the set of options that I'm going to consider as what I might want to do.
That's perfect the way you said it, yes.
I'm going to give a specific follow-up to this. So now that we have the 20-60-20 rule, we have your approach. Maybe everybody else can kind of play along with and see if they get the same answer that you give, which is a specific version of the question. One person sort of asked it this way, is to say, how should we bring people's bias to their attention? Is there a way to call them out respectfully? And I think another part of that is the question of how important is it to be respectful, right? What is that component? What is that doing for you? When and why? So how do you do it respectfully? And should you? Is that a big important part of it?
Yeah, good. Well, I think I'm going to build off of your really nice synthesis a moment ago about what is your goal. Let's be clear on what our goals are. So one of the surprises to me in writing this book was I came to learn that scholars of social movements have shown it's important when real change happens that you have what they describe, or I think I described it, I don't know if they called it this, but I called it heat and light, meaning heat-based activity, which makes people uncomfortable and it's disruptive and it's not, maybe not respectful or not viewed as respectful by some people, versus light-based activity, which is meant to meet people where they are and keep things comfortable. We could think of heat. I like to think of heat as probably what is more effective at changing systems. Light is probably more effective at changing minds. Now, if that's true, it shouldn't surprise us because we know systems and minds both have to change and have changed in the past. And so that's where it becomes really useful that both of those methods be available. Now, some of us are better at heat and some of us are better at light. I'm not so good at heat, I'm a wimp, but I really respect those who can bring the heat. So when we want to bring other people's bias to their attention, the question I would ask is, why? Are we trying to meet them where they are and educate, or are we trying to push and disrupt and create some heat? And that will drive the approach we take. If you want to take a light-based approach in that moment, then what I have found very effective is to make my own learning visible to them. And what I mean by that is be willing to share and be vulnerable about ways in which you have struggled with these issues in the past. So you might say to somebody who uses a word that you think was an inappropriate choice of word to describe someone, you might say, I used to use that word, or there was a time I used to use, and say a different word, and it wasn't till a friend out of love shared with me the impact that had on her when she heard me use that word. Or it wasn't until a student said to me, you know, that word doesn't sound like you. You care about people, and that's a word that says you don't. I want to share with you what I hear when you use that word. So making our learning visible, making our intention to help someone grow visible, and then sharing the truth of what you heard.
Mm-hmm. So that's good for those moments where you want to be respectful.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm putting respectful in the light-based approach, and I am agreeing that there's a time and a place for respectful, and there's a time and a place for heat.
Yeah.
And you know, and I might like remind us that our future selves are going to look back at 2020 and view it differently than we view it now in terms of what was respectful and what wasn't.
Yeah.
To give a very concrete example of that, when Dr. Martin Luther King was alive, 36% of white Americans, only 36% of white Americans felt what he was doing was effective for civil rights.
Yeah.
You know, that percent is obviously very different today. Mm-hmm. So we want to note that sometimes what feels disrespectful in the moment, we're going to actually value in the future.
Okay, so this is gonna, now we're gonna, I'm gonna turn us back inward a little bit because
okay.
I got a lot of questions about, or you got a lot of questions. I sorted through a lot of questions that were about recognizing our own implicit bias. And I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, to start by defining that concept for us, because although we have a very educated group of people who are interested in these topics joining us, there is a lot of, the term is used a lot of different ways. And so you start by defining it and then go into how to sharing your thoughts on how we can better recognize our own implicit biases.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's gone from a word. When I started grad school in 2001, and Nick was a professor in the department where I was a PhD student, like outside of people in that very little world, like, nobody knew what we were talking about. So let's, for the purpose of this conversation, I think we can use the word implicit bias and unconscious bias interchangeably. So let's just know that both of those words float around. I'll probably use both just without realizing it. The way I like to describe it is it's thoughts, it's attitudes, it's sometimes behaviors, it's stereotypes that are sitting outside of our awareness. And the reason they're sitting outside of our awareness is because the way the human mind works is that there's a very small portion of work that our mind does that's right within our awareness and we're super conscious of. Like right now, I'm super conscious of the fact that my hands look gigantic on this screen as I'm, so that's a conscious thought I'm having. But the majority of our mental work happens outside of our awareness. We don't even realize it. You're able to understand the words I'm saying without thinking too hard about what the words mean, or to be facing the screen and not facing the back. I mean, you're not consciously thinking about that, but your mind is doing that work. It's perceiving the colors in the room and the temperature in the room. And studies show that 99%, pick a big number, 99% or some other big number amount of our mental work is happening in that unconscious space. So when we talk about implicit or unconscious bias, we're talking about the associations, the thoughts that are happening in that space. And how do we, I think the second part of your question was, how do we know what they are, our unconscious biases?
Yeah, how do we recognize them in ourselves? Are there sort of ways to check in on our own biases? And are there someone asked if there were any red flags to be looking out for, sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way, I'll give you the scientist answer and then I'll give you the person answer. You can go to a website, implicit.harvard.edu. It's implicit.harvard.edu. It's a research website. It's free. It's anonymous. You don't need to log in or register. Just go in as a guest. And you can take something called the IAT, or the Implicit Association Test. It's about a 10-minute task. It's a little bit like playing a video game. You're going to want kind of 10 uninterrupted minutes on a keyboard, ideally a computer, not a tablet or a phone, where you're going to be like making split second, like 400, 500 millisecond type decisions as to what category different words and pictures go in. And what it's trying to do is just figure out what your associations are between concepts, what concepts are related. So if I say, Jane, peanut butter, you say?
Jelly.
Yeah. So peanut butter jelly is a concept. Those are two concepts Jane has closely associated in her brain. And she probably doesn't remember the moment she started associating peanut butter and jelly in her life, but somehow she may not even like peanut butter and jelly. She may be allergic to peanut butter. But those two ideas stick closely. On the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT, you get a measure of what concepts sit closely in your unconscious mind. You can do one on race, you can do one on gender, religion, there's like a dozen there. You'll get a score at the end of that 10-minute task, and that score is at that moment in time, what were your implicit associations or your implicit biases? I encourage people to take it more than once at different times, look for trend lines. Our unconscious biases are hard to change in really big dramatic ways, but they are influenced in the moment by what you were just thinking of or what you were just exposed to. So it is good to sort of look for trend lines. So that'll give you sort of, I would say, an awareness building insight. It's not a perfect test. Nobody's claiming it's a perfect test. So you don't want to use it for anything other than just a little bit of awareness building. At the same time, that's my scientist answer. At the same time, my person answer is there's a lot once you step into that goodish space that you're going to notice, because your mind isn't doing all this like hard work defending your good person identity. When you're in the good person fixed mindset space, it's really hard to notice things, because researchers of moral identity tell us that we care deeply. Most of us care, at least on a 1 to 7 scale of 4, 5, 6, or 7. We care about feeling like a good person and being seen as a good person. And therefore, if you're in that good person, narrow identity where there's no room to grow, and there's some little evidence that, I don't know, you look like you just took credit for so-and-so's idea, the good person in me is going to shut down that possibility and not entertain it in my mind and deflect it when you say it to me. The goodish person in me is going to say, wow, does it? What did I say? And it's going to listen to the response. So as a person, what we can do to start seeing our unconscious and implicit biases is actively noticing them. Masri Banaji, who you referred to a moment ago, who's the world's expert on unconscious bias, she says that if you think you have no blind spots, that is your blind spot. And so let's just assume your unconscious biases are doing some work. So what I like to do is I take the test, I get a result, and then I say, okay, great. Now I'm going to start paying attention to what are the ways that might sometimes leak into my behavior.
Okay, I'm going to throw another term.
Okay.
Another term that gets thrown around a lot in this space, and this one I think maybe even more than unconscious bias is misunderstood and creates misunderstandings, which is the word of privilege.
Yeah.
You use the term ordinary privilege in your book, which I think I like a lot and think it can help avoid some of this misunderstanding. So I was hoping you could define, basically describe for people what you mean when you say ordinary privilege and why that's also something important to be recognizing in yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so all right, Jane. So I'm totally turning you into my partner here. So I'm gonna do another game with you. We all have lots of identities.
Yeah.
Every one of us, everyone who's listening in. I'm going to ask everyone to sort of think about all the identities they hold, and I'm going to just verbalize some of the identities I hold, the ones that come to mind first. And Jane, I want you to just listen to the identities I share. So I'm a woman, I'm Indian American, I'm a mother, I'm a professor, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm an American. Okay, those are the ones that just came rolling off my tongue. Jane, what are identities based on what you know about me that I didn't say?
You didn't describe some of your scholarship.
Okay.
You didn't describe any of your, you didn't describe attributes that sometimes people might list, like personality traits or
True.
Interests. You didn't list any interests.
True. What are other, like in terms of, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you said that you were, you didn't list your sexuality.
Right. Yes, I'm straight. I did not say I'm straight. Okay, so let's work with that one. I didn't list my sexual orientation that I'm straight, and honestly, it didn't pop to mind. You know why? Because I don't have to think about the fact that I'm straight. Like, the world's made pretty easy for me and my straightness. I don't have to deeply consider my physical safety. My husband and I have been going for a walk every evening during the pandemic. I don't have to think deeply about which neighbors might be watching us and have terribly homophobic views of us. I don't have to worry about whether my job is secure if I have pictures of my husband visible at work. So this thing that I don't have to think about doesn't sit top of mind for me. The things that don't sit top of mind are probably the things that I have some privilege in. And I like the way Debbie Irving uses the metaphor of headwinds and tailwinds. That really helped me understand what privilege meant. If you go for a run, when I use this example, my kids are like, Mom, you don't go for runs. But let's say they don't know that. Okay, let's say I went for a run or a walk, and I'm like, gosh, I am killing it this morning. Ate my Wheaties, and I get to the fire hydrant where I'm going to turn around, and on the way back, I'm suddenly like, whoa, this is killing me, this run, because of course I had that tailwind working with me on the way to the fire hydrant and the headwind on the way back. That tailwind is hard to feel. You don't even notice it, right? Because it's just working in your favor. That headwind is much more visible to the person experiencing it. Meanwhile, somebody's looking out their window watching me run, they may not realize I have a headwind. To them, it looks like, you know, doesn't look like Dolly's trying that hard, or I guess she's from a group that doesn't really value running or effort. You know, it doesn't look like I'm doing much with that headwind in my face. That headwinds and tailwinds helped me understand what we mean when we say privilege. And the identities I think about least, let's go with straightness, that's the identity where I'm not going to feel the tailwind. I'm not even thinking about it. I don't have to. There's no wind in my face on it. And that is not a reflection of there being anything good or bad about the identity. It's a reflection on the world around me and the winds around me and how that treats that dimension of my identity. So the privilege piece is these headwinds and tailwinds. The ordinary piece is that every one of us, because we all have multiple identities, have some identities we think of less than others. And those identities, I bet, are the ones where we have some tailwinds working for us. So ordinary privilege is not like some people have it and some people don't. It's within each of us. We all have some ordinary feature, you know, is English your native language in a country where English is the dominant language? Do you move around? Are you mobile on your legs as opposed to a wheelchair? Do you speak in an accent that's similar to the accents of those you interact with regularly? These are all examples of things you might not have even thought of. Is your religion one that's consistent with the people you work with? Now, ordinary privilege, we all have some ordinary privilege. The hopeful thing about it, well, it's kind of a bummer of a thing, but there's hope in it, is that research says that when somebody is part of a targeted group and speaks up on behalf of that group, racist joke is told, Black person speaks up. What research says is that Black person will not be taken as seriously when they speak up as a white person who speaks up in that moment. That in fact, even if you control in laboratory studies for everything in that moment, the Black person will be viewed as more whiny and the white person will be listened to more in that moment. And there's been similar studies with a similar type of finding around promotions, around hiring. So let's piece it all together. We all have multiple identities. We think of some more than others. The ones we think of less are probably the ones where we have tailwinds or privilege. That's ordinary. We all face this. And whatever identities we think of least, where we most likely have tailwinds, are probably the ones where we have more influence than we realize. Those are the issues where we might actually not speak for someone or instead of someone. We're not in any way trying to center ourselves, but maybe we have more of a role to play and more influence than we realized. So rather than viewing privilege as something to be ashamed of, it's an opportunity to be involved. Thank you. Yeah.
So one of the questions I think was geared very much in this. And so if I was listing my identities, it's very likely that I would not list my race or ethnicity as white, right? That's the easy one to drop. It's the easy one because that's not center on my mind. That's the one that's going to give me a lot of privilege. And so this was one of the questions, was specifically on this notion in terms of, in this moment in time, I think in particular, people are asking, what can white people do to help solve and not exacerbate existing issues? And so if someone wanted to use their privilege in a way to try to solve some of the things that we see as troubling in our world, what would you say? And of course, people can then take that to talk about using other forms of privilege. It doesn't need to be whiteness, but
that's right. Exactly. I mean, it's been really, the amount of activation and interest in getting involved recently has been pretty extraordinary. I think this question speaks to now, what do we do with it now that we're there? And how do we not, lose it? So I wrote a piece on this in June, and I called it, I don't know, I'm a little obsessed with rules, I'm realizing, but I called this one the 10% more rule. And again, if you want to, I'm going to describe it, but if you want to read it, it's on my website. The way it works is it depends on where you are in entering this conversation and this work. If you are truly new to this, like your whiteness, I'm going to stick with your example. You described yourself as white. So your whiteness is something you're considering for the first time. You're considering those tailwinds and headwinds for the first time. Then the thing to do right now is be 10% more mortified. Why 10%? Why? Because goal setting researchers tell us we want goals that are challenging but attainable. 10% more feels like challenging but attainable. Why mortified? Because chances are, if this is the first time you're engaging and thinking about race and whiteness, it's a little mortifying. Like maybe there's things you never noticed before. Maybe there's headwinds and tailwinds that weren't visible to you before. Maybe you're mortified by what you're seeing in the world around you or in your neighbors or in your colleagues. Maybe you're mortified by some things you're noticing inside you. Stay with that. Don't shut down. So you don't have to be mortified all the time, but 10% more mortified than you were, let's say, in April. If you're not completely new to this conversation and work, maybe you've volunteered here or there, you've hashtagged, you've donated, you've posted, then I'm going to say 10% more terrified. And what I mean by terrified is, let's get a little more skin in the game. Like you've been on the bench most of the game, maybe now it's time to get in the game and take a foul. Take a risk, bet on your values. Ask that question at work in the hiring process. Challenge, to our conversation earlier, challenge somebody on social media. Like moments where you would have stepped back, step in this moment. So to me, that's terrifying. So that's why I called it 10% more terrifying, because remember, I'm a whip. And then the last one is, if you are deep in this work, maybe it's because of an identity you hold and you feel like your whole being is the work. Or maybe it's you are on the front lines as an activist doing this work all the time. There I'm saying the next thing for you is 10% more, and I'm putting it in quotes, satisfied. And by satisfied, I don't mean satisfied with the world, satisfied with the state of things. I mean satisfied that the rest of us are stepping up right now. Satisfied that you don't have to educate all of us. Satisfied that you do not have to respond to every pull on your time, every ping on your attention, every request, every demand that you educate people who just started thinking about this. So satisfied that you can come out of the game and breathe and then go back in. So the 10% more rule is, what do we do with our ordinary privilege? If we're new to the work, 10% more mortified. We need you to stay in this. We need you to educate yourself and learn and listen, less than you're talking, even less than you're acting, because we need you to build some knowledge. If you've been connected, but not deeply invested, 10% more terrified. It's time to start acting on your knowledge. And if you're deeply in and so exhausted, 10% more satisfied that you can take a break and come back.
Mm-hmm. So all the questions that we've been sort of asking and answering so far have kind of related to all parts of life, any moment that you might have where you have a chance to engage with somebody else, but even just for yourself. But we also got a whole slew of questions that were specifically about the workplace. And I know that your research focuses on individuals rather than on organizations. Nevertheless, I suspect that you may have important thoughts to share about how individuals within an organization, within a workplace, can try to improve whether it's the diversity, equity, inclusion that's operating at the workplace. So I'll start with the broadest question that I could find on this, so that you basically can decide where you want to go with this, which is, how can we be better champions of diversity and inclusion in our workplace? And so that may tie back to things that you were already saying, but if there's anything, a specific nugget about taking it into our workplaces where we may not have been doing this as much before, your thoughts on how we can be better champions at work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is to simply view it as part of your job. There's been kind of a there's, you know, in organizations that have done anything around this space, there's sort of been like, you know, a department or a person or a committee or a task force, and they do it. That's we're talking about a deeply human moral issue. This isn't something that just gets put in a corner. So the first thing is that we view it as a part of all of our jobs to think about this. If we want our company, our organization, our nonprofit, our school to be as successful as possible, we should be doing this well. You know, the research says that really, really clearly. And so that's the first thing, as part of our job. The second thing, I'll give a really, so that was a very broad answer. I'm going to give a very specific tactical answer as well. Tony Profit, who's at salesforce.com, shared this with me, and I loved it. Run better meetings. I mean, that sounds like kind of, you know, basic MBA 101, you know, like learn how to run a meeting. But when he explained it to me, it was so profound. He said, whatever's happening in your meetings is happening in your organization. And think of meetings in every sense of the word, the Zoom sense, the physical sense, the Slack sense, the text sense, all the ways we convene informally and formally within our workplaces. And he said, think about whoever's getting interrupted, whoever's getting overcredited, undercredited, who's speaking first, whose opinions are being listened to versus discounted, who's being perceived as angry, who's sitting closer to power versus farther from power, who's included and who's not included, who's given advance notice of what we're going to talk about, who's given a chance to informally influence, who knows who. All of those things that sort of happen within a conference room, let's say, are mirrors of what's happening in the broader organization. So if we can think about how to run a better meeting, balance airtime, be intentional about who's there, ensure that the most extroverted, most powerful person isn't the first person to express a point of view, ensure that the boundaries are cross-disciplinary, functional, geographic, that we're creating information flow across the meeting. Why bring people together? It's complicated to schedule meetings. Why do that if we're not going to have effective information flow? All of that I just said is what makes a better meeting. It turns out that's also what makes a more inclusive organization. Mm-hmm. And so answer number one, the broad answer is, view this as part of your job. Answer number two, the tactical answer is, every meeting you're part of, whether you're running it or you're just in it, start noticing the ways in which we're not living up to our potential as a team, and actively, you know, even if you're not running the meeting, you can say, oh, I'd like to go back. I don't think Jane finished her thought. Jane, do you mind repeating what you just said? There's lots of ways we can, even in low power, low status roles, bring forth the kind of equity we want to see.
Mm-hmm. So the next question I was thinking about is thinking about inclusion still, and so I think that the meeting, all of your thoughts on meetings are part of this. But one question that resonated with me was, how do you nurture inclusivity where it hasn't existed before? And I thought that was a really interesting, a different version, not just how do we do it, but if you feel like you're in an environment that doesn't currently value it, how would you create it and nurture it? And so you can certainly go back to the meetings again as one thing to do, but if there's any thoughts that you had specifically on starting, get your thoughts on starting.
Absolutely. I would look for the people, the groups, the demographics that are not visible. I would start looking for who we're not hearing from, who we're not seeing. One of the things that shows up both in research as well as anecdotes is how Black women are often sort of both highly visible and highly invisible in their organizations. On the one hand, very visible because often they're in organizations where they're not they're in a small minority, but invisible in that they're not included, they're not, their input is not valued in a meaningful way. I tell an anecdotal story in my book that backs up that research of a Black senior executive and just her literally being looked through and looked past in a room full of other executives, of no one engaging her, of her standing in a sort of the cocktail hour part of an event in a group full of people and waiting for someone to include her, to introduce themselves, and just being looked through. These things happen really frequently. So we have to actively look for who are we not noticing. Mm-hmm. And I promise you, we're all not noticing people in our organizations. I'm pretty sure I have walked by the adjunct faculty in an academic institution. Adjunct faculty are not full-time employees. I'm pretty sure I've walked by many adjunct faculty on my floor in my department without honestly even registering that I've probably walked by them a dozen times and never introduced myself. Who are we not noticing? I think that's a good place to start.
Mm-hmm. And I like very much how you just, you told us earlier about that you will often shine a light on yourself as a way to help us with learning. And so I appreciate that example right there. When people say that they want to see their organization do more on diversity and inclusion, and that's kind of vague because I think that's the way a lot of people feel about it. They don't even quite know what they want. They just want to see doing more.
Yeah.
I wanted to know if you had any advice on that. And then this kind of ties back a little bit to what you were talking with the 10% more. Does it differ depending on either your role in the organization? Does it differ depending on your race or your gender or your social identity? But when you think about what you're going to tell someone who wants to see their organization do more on this issue, right, especially right now, how do we make sure it's not just platitudes and symbolic things? How do we make sure it's real action? I want to do more. What do I do?
Yeah. I think a great place to start with doing more as data is let's start tracking things. Mm-hmm. Not because everything can be measured, everything cannot be measured, but a lot of things can be measured that aren't being measured. Mm-hmm. Who are we? We can do this on individual level, a team level, or organizational level. Like if I'm on an individual level, let's just take me as an individual. Who do I ask for advice when I'm sort of stuck on a work issue? Who do I reach out to? When I need a confidant, who do I confide in? Start thinking about and tracking sort of what are my data points. As a team, as an organization, now we can go, really big. Well, there's no pipeline. That's the reason we have only 4% of our employees are people of color, is that because there's just, they don't apply. All right, well, let's start getting really clear. Let's start looking at where we're advertising or how we're hiring or who we're networking with, and what do those pipelines look like? If in fact there's no people of color in those pipelines, we don't have the right pipelines. We need to start quantifying what we're looking at and not just assuming that if you build it, they will come. And then the next step would be to be as transparent as we can with that data. That terrifies organizations. I understand why it terrifies organizations, but if ever there was a moment to do it, it's now. To say, we're mortified, we looked at our data, the number's 4%, that's ridiculous, we're gonna keep doing better. So let's start tracking things and let's start making it visible in public.
Mm-hmm. So in moments, Dolly, I've heard you share about fatigue that it can come from fighting for equity and justice in the world. And yet from an outsider's perspective, I would say that if you didn't say that, I would never have known that because you look like you never get tired. We know that fatigue in this space is very, very real. Do you have any advice for both, right? We want to capture this moment. I know that, but we also, especially for people, as you had sort of pointed out earlier, for people who have been in this fight forever and who are getting tugged in every different way,
Yeah.
what's your advice for managing the fatigue, both for individuals and around the topic? How do we make sure it stays alive and people don't get just tired of the topic, you know?
Yeah.
Fatigue in both of those senses.
Yeah, both of those senses. I mean, part of this is the 10% more. I mean, that's why I wrote that piece late June, and I was worried about my own fatigue, and I was worried about our national fatigue at that moment. So part of it is you know, Jane, you and I were in a different meeting earlier today, and I forget who said it, maybe it was you, but somebody said, like, there's no quick fixes in this work. There are no quick fixes. Let's not set ourselves up for disappointment and sort of exacerbating our fatigue with that expectation. Let's set ourselves up for a marathon, not a sprint. And that's the 10% more piece. I love the metaphor that in one of the interviews I did for the book, it was with Subha Berry, who leads Working Mother Media. And she talked about a flock of birds. She was flipping through channels on TV and stumbled upon a nature documentary about how V formations, that when birds fly, and that she learned, and I didn't know this until she told me, was that the bird that's at the tip of the V, that bird rotates to the back. It's not always the same bird. And the reason is, now it's a different use of headwinds and tailwinds, is that, you know, they're the ones kind of breaking that headwind as they fly, and that's an exhausting role to play. So it's really important that the flock constantly be rotating. And I thought that was a really powerful way that she uses to manage her own energy, and that I've tried to apply to my own, that stay with the flock, but you don't always have to be at the front of the flock.
Yeah.
You know, we can sort of look for ways. And so 10% more, rotate through the V formation. And then the last thing I would say is do the work in whatever space you're already in the jobs you're already in. I promise you there are things you can do in the spaces you're in, the communities you're in, the teams you're in, the families you're in. You don't have to go, you could go do things other than that, but if you can't, just do it where you are. And there's a lot of impact you can have where you are.
So we are quickly running short on time. So the last thing I'm going to do, just before we end, I want to give you the last word, Dolly. If there's any thoughts that you want to leave us with, any actions that we should take if we want to keep learning.
Well, everyone should take Jane Risen's class. I'm completely jealous that I can't. I would really, really love to. You know, I'll share with you the story I end the book with, which is the story of Joe McNeil of the Greensboro Four, who helped lead the lunch counter sit-ins in 1960, the Woolworth's lunch counter. He came to speak to my students a number of years in a row. The first time he came, he gave these beautiful, inspiring remarks. I mean, he's an iconic civil rights figure. Like, there's statues made of him in the museum, the Smithsonian Museum. And so he's this iconic figure. He gives these beautiful, inspiring remarks. We get to the Q&A, and one of the students says, General McNeil, thank you so much for your courage. Thank you so much for joining us. Sir, what are your views on gay rights? And this wonderful, dear man who's become a dear friend of mine stumbled on that question, like really badly and publicly. And what ensued over the next few years, as I got to know him better, and as he came back year after year to speak with my students, was a visible change in his views. And when I finally got to the point of writing the book and I asked him, I said, I'm curious if you remember what happened the first time you met with my students. And he said, oh my God, yes. I didn't even have to remind him. He was like, oh, yeah, I remember. I said, what was that? What happened? What's happened since? He said, you know, this work of being a good person isn't always easy. There's things I had to unlearn. I mean, he's using kind of my vocabulary, not his own, but I'm paraphrasing. I, in that moment, thought to myself, if he, an icon, a man who has literally been willing to lay down his life, if he can take the cigarette burns that were put on him while he sat at that lunch counter, the hot scalding coffee that was poured on his head, if he can sit through that and still emerge viewing himself as a work in progress, who has somebody who has things to learn, who's goodish, who's not sitting on his good person laurels, if he's still goodish, I feel like I can be, and we can be, and we can all be. We can all just keep getting better.
Yeah, that is a beautiful story to end on. So our event is ending, and I just want to give a final set of thank yous. Thank you to the entire CDR team who worked with the teams to make this whole thing happen. Thank you again, one more time, to Dolly for joining us for this conversation. And thank you to everybody who I can't see, but I know who is out there watching, because it's wonderful to have everybody here wanting to learn more about becoming the people that we mean to be. And we'll end it here.